slides, okay, because we don't have a lot of time. Okay, so let me start with my presentation. Am I able to share my screen, Professor
Yes, ma'am.
Nagmani? Yeah, it's
Yes, ma'am.
visible,
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
So I will just make it slideshow. And I will not be able to see the chat box when I'm on the screen. So I will come back to it later. Okay, yeah. So as you already know, my presentation is titled Discourses Beyond the Divide, Integrating Contemporary Approaches to Gender in Literature. Previously, I had given you the title in the literature classroom, but then I thought, not everybody might be teachers here. Some of you might be just researchers, some of you might be just curious, right? And you might be attending the webinar because you want to learn more. Okay, so let us just, as I think students of literature, depending on whatever language you are teaching, I think we are all dealing with literature either in the English classroom or in the women's studies class or gender studies classroom. We are looking at gender extensively today, and in the past 1 or 2 decades, gender studies has gained a lot of momentum in Indian classrooms, especially. Okay, and you know what the political scene is, you know what the activist scene is. There is a lot of visibility of different genders, and there is something called as the gender spectrum that we are looking at today when we look at gender. Okay, so the whole idea of this presentation is to try and accommodate emerging discourses of gender beyond this divide that we are all, hooked on to, which is the divide between masculine and feminine or male and female identity. Okay, this divide between sex and the sex divide or the gender divide, as we call it. Okay, so the whole point of this presentation would be to look at gender beyond that traditional or classical notion of addressing these binaries or these sexes or genders as binaries. So I'm going to question the binary itself to begin with. Okay, so so this is basically the outline of my presentation. It's not necessarily a progressive outline, or it's not going to go in this order, but these are the important concerns that I'm going to address. So, seemingly impossible divides that we have built around discourses of gender, right? Which is basically, right, when we look at questions of equality or equity or even writing the body, okay, or post-colonial feminism, okay, there is a tendency to look at women as a very separate entity, or women's concerns as something that is far removed from men, right, or the general population. Okay, so the whole binary approach that we take to gender and sex, right, and the seeming impossibility of the divide, the fact that you cannot break this divide, or that you cannot counter this divide, or that you have to deal with this divide. And feminism seems to be largely a quarrel with this binary. Okay, and you know that Simone de Beauvoir actually, talks about this divide and this seemingly impossible divide in The Second Sex. Okay, and she looks at the universality or the historicity of both sexual difference and gender differentiation across cultures, across histories, across the world. Okay, and for her, this becomes a very important philosophical, existential question. The fact that you are not born a woman, but you become one, right? And you have to deal with that identity in its entirety, right? And there is nothing you can do about it because it is imminent. And although you might transcend that identity, it is out of this imminence that you transcend. Okay, so to a large extent, our popular approaches to gender in the literature class have been approaches of feminism. Okay, this is not to discount that feminism has a long tradition and that we should stop looking at feminists. But first and foremost, I'm a feminist. But I realized that with a few years of research and teaching and the kind of interactions I have with scholars who are working on gender, it is important for us to extend the definitions that we have of both masculinity and femininity. Because when we look at feminism, when we look at the concept of woman, and when we challenge that concept, or when we negate that concept, or when we critique the essentialist understanding of who a woman is, right, which is the basis of feminism, we also need to understand that there isn't one kind of femininity, right? So the femininity that we assume through the biological sex, which is female, and the social gender that is constructed around the female body, is a very limited understanding of femininity. So when we are looking at a woman, okay, or the concept of womanhood, or the notion of a female identity based on biological sex, right, these become very questionable things, especially in the present scenario, right, when you have, multitudes of discourses of gender which come from different identities, who identify themselves as female. For example, you have the Hijra identity, okay, which is basically a transgender male to female identity, okay. And most of the Hijras in India would like to call themselves women, right? They would like to perform their gender as something that is feminine and socially acceptable, okay. So they might have questioned the biological notion of sex by undergoing a sex change, okay, or by not undergoing a sex change, but by simply cross-dressing, but they are still, performing the feminine gender, right? So when we look at women or when we look at feminism, do we look at identities which are not essentialist, okay, which do not fall under the very easy category of woman, which is very clearly defined in terms of biological sex? So this is one question that I would like to ask you. The second question is the question of sexuality, right? Because sexuality is a very important aspect of both one's sex as well as gender, right? So when you look at a lesbian identity, for example, or you look at an identity which is not essentially female in the normative terms, right? For example, you look at an intersex adult, right? What you would probably traditionally call as a hermaphrodite, right? So a hermaphrodite is a being who has both male and female sexual characteristics, okay? So there are identities which are mapped on with a feminine identity. For example, if you have an intersex child, at the time of the birth of the child, in most cultures across, especially in the West, it is the parents who decide which gender should be assigned to the child, because you see, the child anatomically has both sexual characteristics, and this is of course seen as an anomaly, or it is seen as something abnormal, right? But that is a very traditional approach. So what this simply means is that the child does not have a say in terms of what gender it will perform or what gender it will take based on its biological sex, which is ambiguous. So when you look at the constitution of femininity, say, or masculinity on such a body, right, there is a surgical operation that is performed, and suppose there is a predominance of female genitalia, then the body becomes not just female but also becomes feminine, right, by virtue of becoming a female body. So the male portions of the genitalia are removed surgically. Otherwise, if the male genitalia is prominent, the female portions are removed, of course, with the consent of the parents. Okay, so there is the intervention of science and society at the very beginning of an identity, which is the birth of the child. Okay, so the idea that both sex and gender are therefore constructed. Okay, so the idea that we all have sexual characteristics, we are all born with sexual characteristics, which are extensively, largely called male or female, right? But we are not born male or female, right? We belong to a predominant culture which associates the formation of certain genitalia at the time of birth to a male body, or the other way around, it is the female body. Okay, so the presence of the phallus would be a male body and the absence of the phallus would be a female body, right? And that is how usually at the moment of birth the sex of the child is determined. And that is the point at which we are in gender studies today, where we recognize that sex is biologically determined. It is not biological, right? Because biology is a narrative just as much as fiction is, just as much as, say, literature is or philosophy is. So these are all narratives that are mapped onto the body, right? This is not to say that a majority of the population does not have male characteristics or female characteristics. Yes, predominantly most of us have either or these characteristics, and these characteristics can change over a period of time. So you see, as women attain puberty, it's possible that they have a precedence of testosterone rather than progesterone, and there might be a lot of body hair and facial hair, okay, which is not symptomatic of being feminine, right? So the understanding that when we talk about femininity and masculinity in gender studies in the contemporary context, we are not just looking at a very clear, progressive gender emerging out of a certain innate biological sex. So the idea that sex is innate, the idea that sex is something that you're born with and that gender is something that is ascribed, is now debatable in gender studies across philosophy, across anthropology, across even science. Okay, even science is questioning the the natural essence of sex, which seems to be something that you're born with. Okay, so the idea that masculinities and femininities are part of a larger spectrum. So, this is not to say that, right, for example, I'm not a woman, right? But it is to say that I am one woman among many women. So there are different kinds of femininities among which I choose to call myself. Maybe I'm straight, maybe I'm Hindu, maybe I'm Indian, maybe I'm, say, maybe upper middle class. I'm urban because I was raised in the city, okay? And I come from a certain educational background and a certain class and a certain caste. So all of these go on to make me feminine or a woman in a certain way. And these are identities that are interrelated, that coexist. There is a polyvalence of identity. So I am not just a woman because I have the biological sex, characteristics of what is considered to be female. But rather, the idea that I am a woman also has to do with a lot of different identity markers. And that is why there isn't one woman that feminism is countering. There isn't one femininity or one kind of femininity which feminism is challenging or discussing, right, in its purview. Okay, so the question therefore is there a long history of feminism which reinforces the very binary that it appears to challenge? It seems so, because in most of our debates of feminism, we have left out, for example, the men, right? So you might ask me, why do we need to talk about men, right? Because if you're talking about gender equality, you will have to talk about both genders. But that does not seem to be the history of feminism, right? And after the second wave of feminism, in the West at least, we have started talking about masculinities. We have started talking about queer movements. We are talking about identities across the spectrum, right? And this gives you the possibility of a dialogue, right? So we have moved towards a dialogic consciousness, right, which looks at the gender spectrum rather than looking at just femininity and masculinity as two outcomes of being male or female. Okay, so there are very important paradigm shifts in approaches to gender, right, both in academia and in the political space. Okay, so I will be introducing you to some of these approaches that both the theorists as well as writers who are writing about gender concerns have taken in their, approaches to femininities and masculinities. Okay, so the idea that feminism today is an inclusive feminism, right, which, for example, includes masculinities, right? It would be interesting for you to know that masculinities as a discipline is very sociological. So who are the people who are talking about masculinities today? They are mostly in sociology departments, just as people who talk about women's studies were first in the English department, right? So it is English departments across the world who have actually promoted, women's studies and feminist studies. And, isn't it interesting that although we are talking about women and different aspects of women's identity, it is the Department of English and Foreign Languages which is giving scope for us to talk about gender, and that is because it has been historically so. Somehow, because of the predominance of women's writing since the 19th century across the world, right, literature departments have looked at feminism largely, and it is also very interesting, therefore, that sociology departments and anthropology departments have looked at masculinities and continue to look at masculinity. So today, if you're looking at who the scholars are who are working on men and masculinities, you will mostly find them in universities that have sociology departments and departments of anthropology. I will come back to masculinities a little later, but I would like you to look at a few very important approaches, okay, to gender, right, that have emerged since the 20th century at least, right? One is, of course, the famous approach, the Foucauldian approach of historiography and genealogy. And then you have the Afro-American feminist movement, which initiated the approach towards intersectionality. And finally, we have, right, the very interesting queer approach to gender, which is basically performativity and affect. So these are very important. These are both concepts as well as approaches. Okay, so these emerged as concepts, right, which were theoretical in nature, right, which were founded on a certain philosophy of gender, right? But gradually they became part of a larger discourse of gender, and they became what you could call approaches to gender. Okay, so I'll come back to that a little later. So these are the popular approaches that I have seen being practiced. Okay, not all of us have women's studies departments or gender studies departments, but we do have one unit on gender, or we have a few representative texts on gender. But most of the time, what is it that we discuss as gender in the literature class? You will see that, I'm sure you will all agree with me, that it is feminism which becomes the face of gender in most contexts, right? So what is it that we talk about gender? What is it that we take about gender to class? It is usually feminism and women's concerns, okay? So acknowledging this long history of women's movements and its significance for our, very basis of questions of gender, debates about gender, giving them full, credit for the movement, right? Let us also look at extending this further, right? So how do you extend gender debates in the classroom? How do you factor in contemporary approaches to gender beyond the classical notions of feminism? Okay, do we address the heterogeneity of gender beyond sexual difference and gender differentiation? Because gender is heterogeneous, gender is multiple, gender is plural. There is a polyvalence. There are multiple voices of gender. Do we factor that in, or are we still looking at gender in terms of equality and equity? Okay. Is gender essentialist or constituted by the plurality of discourses which define subject consciousness or object relations, right? So the idea that gender is something that is mapped onto you because of a certain sex that you're born into is an essentialist concept. And we know that the history of feminism has shown us that woman is an essentialist concept. It's an essentialism. What is essentialism? Basically, essentialism is any approach, philosophical approach towards an entity in very purely, reductive terms or narrow terms. So if I'm going to tell you, right, that, you are a woman and therefore, you are supposed to be kind, supposed to be altruistic, self-sacrificing, you're supposed to be loving and giving, you're supposed to be soft and emotional, right? And when you write, you are supposed to use a very descriptive language because you're a woman, right? Or that you have to, say, for example, become a mother because you have a womb. These are very essentialist notions of, woman, anything for that matter, right? So when something is reduced to certain very innate or supposedly natural qualities, that is when it becomes essentialist, okay? Yeah. So gender obviously is not essentialist. It is not one kind of gender, or it is not one kind of, or one set of characteristics that inform a particular gender. We know that, okay? So the very important movement that we see across gender studies especially is, right, to begin with, if you look at somebody like Simone de Beauvoir, she's looking at subjectivity. She's looking at the idea of immanence and transcendence. Obviously, she is an existentialist philosopher. The idea that you are dealing with the self in terms of your subjectivity, in terms of the I, right? And the idea that gender, right, is a consciousness, right, which informs your subjectivity. But then we have moved away from that phenomenological or existential approach to gender to, right, the idea that it is not subjectivity alone which informs your identity, right, but it is your identity politics in turn which informs your subjectivity. What that simply means is you are not just a subject. You are a subject, right, which is defined, or who is defined in relation to other entities, other aspects of existence. And therefore, right, a subject cannot be separated. There is no pure subject which stands away from the object relations that it has with various different objects. So to begin with, the subject is an object, right? Without becoming an object in relation to other subjects, you cannot think about subjectivity. So there is something called as the identity turn or the identity shift that happens towards the end of the second wave feminist movement, right? And questions of subjectivity, which are central to philosophy, right, begin to be asked in terms of identity. So that is what we mean by identity politics, right? So today we are not talking about just the subject, or we are not talking about the discursive formation of the subject. Rather, we are looking at the politics of identity which informs the subject. And that is what gives gender its polyvalence. Because like I said, you are not just a woman or a man. right? You have other identity markers which inform your identity as a man or a woman or whatever it is that you are across the gender spectrum. Okay, so let me come down to the very basic terms, sex and gender. Okay, so today we recognize that at least the theories of gender, right, and theories of philosophy around gender and sex recognize the fact that sex is biologically determined and gender is socially constructed. But how do you separate gender from sex? How do you separate your, socio-cultural identity from your body? Right? In fact, we realize today that sex and gender are dialectical. They are not oppositional. Okay? So when you look at something as male and female, you are not looking at two opposites, right? And when you begin to look at them as opposites, that is when you look at binary opposition. So both sex and gender are not founded upon opposition. Rather, they are founded on a dialectical relationship. Now, what is a dialectical relationship? A dialectical relationship is a relationship that is complementary. A dialectical relationship is based on relations of dependence. Okay, so what that simply means is for myself to call myself as a woman, right? I will have to do everything, right, that is not done by a man. Okay, so what is our understanding of femininity? Our understanding of femininity is dependent upon our relationships with masculinity. Okay, so whatever a man should not be is what a woman is, and whatever a woman should not be is what a man is. Okay, it's impossible for us to think of masculinity without femininity and femininity without masculinity. And when that is the relationship between the genders, right? Is it possible, therefore, for us to look at gender in its entirety as either masculine or feminine? That is something that we are looking at. So when your identity is relational, your identity is not necessarily oppositional, just as day and night are complementary, right? You cannot define night without day, and you cannot define day without night, right? So they have a relationship. They might seem to be contrary to each other. There might be a politics of difference or a relationship of difference, but difference need not mean differentiation. Something being contrary need not mean contradiction. I can be different from you, and I can be I only when I'm different from you. And that is the basis of, the idea that something is dialectical. There is a dialectical relationship. It is not an oppositional relationship. Okay. So the second important thing is identity informs subjectivity. You cannot think about a pure subject, right? I don't think philosophy anymore holds up that notion of I, which is a pure subject, which is, untrammeled or unperturbed by other aspects of identity. Can you think of an I without, right, the markers of gender or sex or class or caste or race or ethnicity, age, ability? Okay, can we do any of these things and talk about the subject? We cannot. When you talk about the subject, it needs to be qualified in terms of how it identifies itself, right? And identification is always with, right? So you identify with or you identify as. So identity is relational. Identity is not something that you always already have. It's not something that you already are born with. Identity is a process, and that is the reason why we recognize that the subject is a present continuous tense. Basically, it's a process. There is no subject that is always already there. So when I'm talking about, say, a man or a woman, I'm not talking about an entity who has come out of the machine called the body, right? And based on the sex of the body, perform certain functions, right? I'm talking about a process of being. Okay, so we have moved away from becoming to being, right? So you see the shift there. You see, Beauvoir talked about becoming a woman, right? And today's understanding of gender has even gone beyond becoming, because we are not talking about becoming because there is no end result. There is no what we call as a teleological process. So a teleological process is a process where you have a beginning and it logically leads to an end. So I am not in the process of becoming a woman, right? I am a woman because of certain processes of being which are in interaction with other identity markers. So if I am a Hindu, for example, right, I will have to probably right wear a bindi, right, to be a Hindu woman. So I'm not just a woman; I'm a Hindu woman. Okay, and I belong to a certain class. I belong to a certain family background. I belong to a certain community. I belong to a certain neighborhood. I belong to a certain region, a certain language. Okay, so I have a linguistic identity because I speak Kannada at home. I'm a Kannadiga. Okay, and a Kannada woman, I'm very sure, is very different from a Tamil woman. Okay, and being a Kannada woman or a Kannadiga, right, is an identity. Okay, it's not myself. It is not my subjectivity, because my subjectivity probably is a philosophical category that I can go on and on and on about, but I cannot be a subject without the different processes of identification. Therefore, both your sex and gender, among many other things, right, are contingent. What does that mean? It means that right now I am wearing a bindi and I do not have a problem identifying myself as a Hindu. I do not have a problem living in Bangalore. I don't have a problem with the designation and educational qualification that comes after my name, or I don't have a problem being associated with a certain university where I work. Okay, I do not have any problems with these identities. I am actually identifying myself with or identifying myself as these identity markers, and that is a choice that I have made right now in this moment. So maybe after 5 years you may not find me in Christ University. You might find me, I mean, just an example. Okay, say suppose I'm in SRM University. I'm definitely sure that that's going to change my identity, right? Because I'm not in Christ anymore, I'm in SRM. And if I talk to all of you there in SRM University, you will tell me that being in SRM is a very unique thing. It's a very different thing. Okay, it's something that is very contingent to your own reality. It is immediate. So there is an immediacy to your identity, but this immediacy need not be permanent, right? Both sex and gender can change. There are people who change their sex or who undergo a sex transformation or a surgery, right? Or they take hormones to change the body, right? There are people who cross dress, right? There are people who perform their gender differently, right? Something as simple as I cut my long hair short, right? And I dress up, in a way which does not make me feminine but makes me more masculine. It's possible. I can do it tomorrow. I can go to the salon and I can change the way in which I dress. I can change my wardrobe tomorrow and I can perform a different gender, right? The fact that all of us are male or female, right, is a choice, and therefore the idea that we are performing either masculine or feminine genders are contingent to the roles that we perform right now, right, depending on the society that we belong to, the culture that we belong to, and the different groups, social groups that we belong to. Okay, and just as sex and gender are contingent, or they are constructed or constituted by different identity markers, so also is your sexuality. Okay, it might be very interesting for you to know that sexuality is also historically constructed, right? And that is not what I am saying. That is what is the crux of Michel Foucault's work on gender, right? So if you look at his history of sexuality in 4 volumes, you will see that the crux of all his life's work is about establishing the fact that we are all historical beings and that we are historically and temporally constructed. What that means is you belong to a certain time in history, you belong to a certain moment in history, and that is what constitutes your sexuality. So to give you an example, if you belonged to the ancient Greek civilization, right, especially during Plato's time, right? If you look at Plato's Republic, there are certain sections in Plato's Republic which very clearly talk to you about the aesthetics of homosexuality, for example. What that simply means is that, there was a time in history when people could be fluid with their sexuality. That sexuality did not entail attraction to the opposite sex alone. Okay, so what this simply means is that, during Plato's time, men were encouraged to have multiple relationships. In fact, marriage was seen as something that was more functional, right? It was meant for procreation of the species, for adding numbers to the civilization. But men were also encouraged to have relationships with the same sex outside of marriage. You can look it up. You can go back to certain volumes of, historical work. You can even look at same-sex love in India, right? which is an anthology compiled by Salim Kidwai, okay, I forget, and Ruth Vanita, right? You can look up this text. So across cultures, right, you will see that there are historical moments when, right, what is today considered to be homophobic was totally acceptable and also promoted in certain societies, okay? So Foucault uses the term genealogy and archaeology, actually. So he believes that basically your body is something like an archaeological site, right? And then if you dig deep or if you excavate into bodies from the past, you will actually see that the bodies were different, or the way in which we expressed our bodies or spoke about our bodies or represented, right, masculinity and femininity through the body was very different, okay? So to give you an example, you know that in the 17th and early 18th centuries, right, there was a lot of, I mean, you look at, men wore powdered wigs, right? Men, were very dandified, and, they would carry a walking stick, and their, clothes would be very embellished, okay? You would see instances of women and men dressed in the same way, okay, or in similar fashion. So there is a time when European men were very fashionable, to the extent that they wore horse hair, right, wigs that were made of horsehair on their wigs, and they powdered these wigs. And a man of class, a man of dignity, right, wouldn't step out of the house without, a nice stick and a wig, right? So you have the fop or the dandy, right, who tells you that men dress differently during different periods of time, right? Yeah, it's not just women, right? Who, I mean, when is it that, women became so ornamental, so, exclusively dressed up, right? So when is it that, masculinity became toned down to very plain dressing, right? And this is a process of industrialization, basically, because men are seen as public beings, and you see them wearing the same kinds of colors or the same kinds of clothes, right? There isn't much variety there, right? But when you see two women, probably you don't see much. I mean, you don't see a lot of similarity. You will see them, dressing very differently. So, to a large extent, it is industrialization which made men a homogeneous set of people without an individual face, without an individual being, to that extent. Okay, so there is the archaeology of being, right, which is something that is historically, it is historically possible to go back to and study. And there are these genealogies. And what are genealogies? Genealogies are very different from the genealogy that we are aware of, which is the family tree or the lineage. Okay, we are not talking about genealogy with a capital G here. We are talking about genealogies, which is plural. Okay, and what is the genealogy of gender, right? So there are people who have very inglorious origins, according to Foucault. He uses the term inglorious origins. So there are people who will never enter into history because they were women, or because they were, say probably they were mad people or insane. They were in madhouses. The sick, right? The insane, right? Women and children, infirm people, disabled people, right? People who were, say, for example, prisoners, right? Or people who had health issues and were sent to the sanatoriums. These were all excluded from history, right? So there is a larger genealogy, right, which is hegemonic, and that is controlled by the powers that be. And there are people who will never enter into this larger scheme of history. And this is what he refers to as genealogies. So genealogies is a concept that allows you to look at the voices that have been silenced, voices that have not figured in history, voices that have fallen through the cracks in history, literally. Okay, so when we talk about sexuality, right, we are mostly concerned about heterosexuality and a very heteronormative understanding of sexuality. Okay, but sexualities are contingent as much as sex and gender are, and sexualities are actually informed by history, which means that my sexuality is determined by the time or period, right, or the space or the history that I belong to at this moment. If I were living in a different society, probably my sexuality would have been very different. Okay, yeah. So I would just like to quote this from Foucault, which I think brings things into perspective. So he says, there is no need for arms, physical violence, material constraints, just a gaze, an inspecting gaze, a gaze that each individual under its weight will end by internalizing to the point that they are their own overseer, each individual thus exercising surveillance over and against themselves. So what Foucault is talking about is that your gender, your sex, your sexuality is constantly under surveillance. And how does a certain sex or gender become normal? How does it become natural? Right? So if sex is constructed, then how is sex considered to be biologically natural? Why is it that we believe that we are born into a certain sex? It is because, right, there is a surveillance that the individual himself internalizes. So there is a society that is constantly gazing at you. So you have the panopticon, as he calls it. So this is a term that Foucault borrows from Jeremy Bentham. So what is a panopticon? A panopticon is a concept or a system whereby you have the superintendent of the jail or the prison at the center. So there is a watchtower and the prison cells are around that watchtower. So what happens is the jailer or the superintendent of prison, right, of prisons is able to, right, actually, survey the entire space of the prison, and all the convicts are constantly under surveillance. Okay. So according to Foucault, this is how societies operate. Right. So we belong to systems or in institutions where we are constantly under surveillance. So for example, the clothes that I wear, right? For me to be a woman, I have to wear feminine clothes. I have to speak in a feminine way. I have to even laugh and talk and walk in a feminine way, right? So I just want you to look at an early, 12th century, feminist, right, who is actually Akka Mahadevi. I'm sure you're all familiar with Akka Mahadevi, right? So Akka Mahadevi actually was married off to the king of a province who fell in love with her. But from childhood, Akka Mahadevi had absolutely no interest in marriage or marital relationships or setting up a family, right? So there was a sense of, spirituality in her, right? So she was a deeply spiritual person who was forced into marriage. And, you're talking about the 12th century. She was married when she was extremely young, right? And she left the kingdom and she left the, husband who she was married to, right? And her renunciation, right, was to the extent that she gave up her clothes. Okay. So of course, she was stoned. She was called a mad woman because she was going around without clothes, right? And it took her some time to actually reach the Anubhava Mantapa, where all of these male philosophers, the Vachanakaras, were actually, having philosophical discourses. And she was one of the first women to be given access to this philosophical space, which was predominantly male. Okay. And I think Simone de Beauvoir talks about this, right? So also does Luz Irigaray. So there are women philosophers who were actually, in fact, Simone de Beauvoir was the first woman to join the School of Philosophy in Paris. We all know that, right? So there is a history of philosophy which is largely, male, right? Dominated by men. And if you look at Virginia Woolf, she's talking about the same thing. She's talking about Oxford and Cambridge and how these are basically potential sites for men and masculinity, right? And there is no place for women, and women are not considered to be scholarly. And that is where that entire book that she writes, okay, A Room of One's Own, actually comes from. It comes from her visit to Oxford and Cambridge, where women are not even included in academic discussions or in academic spaces. She has to get a letter of entry to enter the portals of the library at Oxford or to enter the lawns of Cambridge University. So this is the late 19th century that we are talking about, early 20th century, the turn of the century, right, when Virginia Woolf starts talking about women and how women need to write, and that is how they need to find a space of their own. So I want you to go back to the 12th century and look at what this great saint, this great saint of the Bhakti movement, or what we call as the Bhakta movement, because we are talking about women, right, and spirituality, right? She questioned the very basis of biological sex and the social constitution of gender way back in the 12th century. Okay, people, male and female, blush when a cloth covering their shame comes loose, when the Lord of lives lives drowned without a face in the world. How can you be modest, right? So the sense of clothing and the fact that we wear clothes to cover our sense of shame, right? And the fact that our identity is something sinful or shameful and that we cover it, right? When the Lord of the lives lives without a face, right? And he lives drowned without a face. He does not have an identity, right? He does not have an identity marker, right? So the larger transcendental consciousness or supreme consciousness, right, which informs life and living, lives without a face, without raiment, without garment, without clothing. Whereas we people go around covering our bodies in shame with a piece of cloth. Okay, I want you to look at the other two extracts that I have brought here. Not one, not two, not three or four, but through 84,000 vaginas have I come from. Right? Isn't this very interesting? Because she discounts the very notion of identity as something that you are born with as a result of being birthed as a male or a female from a vagina. Right? So she says, I belong to a much longer tradition. I belong to a much longer sensibility than just the biological act of being born into a sex and therefore into a gender. Till the fruit is ripe inside, the skin will not fall off. I had a feeling it would hurt you if I displayed the body's seals of love. So she is using extremely unconventional metaphors to talk about spirituality. And that is the beauty about Akka Mahadevi and a lot of these spiritual, reformers, right, who defied the conventions. Okay. And in Akka Mahadevi's case, she questioned both her biological sex as well as her social gender by giving up her sense of clothing. Right. And she says, when you're spiritually ripe, when the fruit is ripe, then you don't need clothes. The skin has to fall off. Right. And when the fruit is ripe, the skin has to fall off. And I knew that you definitely would not like to see me like this in my entirety, right? In the state of enlightenment where I don't need any identity marker, right? Where I have given up every marker, including my clothing, right? So probably the first thing that you wear when you come to this earth, which informs your identity, is your clothes, right? So right from, when you were a child, right, the colors that were chosen for you, the clothes that were chosen for you, the length of hair that was chosen for you, the way in which you were asked to speak, right? The fact that if you were a boy, if you scraped your knee or if you fell down, you were not allowed to cry, because more often than not, mothers would say, don't cry because you're a boy, you have to be strong. Okay. Similarly, girls are not allowed to laugh, right? So you laugh out loudly. They say, how can you laugh like that? Girls giggle, boys laugh. Girls titter and twitter, right? And they have this tinkling laughter, which, right, probably is a subdued laughter, which, is gendered. So everything that you do, right, is clothed. Everything that you do is scaffolded. Everything that you wear, including your flesh, bears a marker, which is your sex and your gender. Okay. And way back in the 12th century, right, or in the 11th century, you have this very interesting poet called Devara Dasimaya, who is also a Vachanakara, right? He's a religious reformer. He asks similar questions. He says, if you see, long hair and breasts coming, you think that that's a woman, right? And if you see somebody with short hair, right, without breasts, you call that person a man, right? And is this the only way in which you can go through life, being a man or a woman? So these are very important questions, right, that literature has been asking, right? So I want you to actually question the notion of what is modern or what is traditional or ancient. We like to think that whatever is ancient or traditional, right, did not question gender, or that gender is a very modern phenomenon, or gender studies is something that we are talking about now in the past 2 or 3 decades. No. Gender has always been questioned. Even sex, the biological notion of sex, has been questioned from time immemorial. And that is the only reason why I wanted you to look at an ancient text. Because, see, although I'm talking about contemporary approaches, the important word that I want to highlight there is approaches. So even if you take an ancient text, right, it is possible for you to look at it as a modern text in terms of its idea. So you can take a contemporary approach to an otherwise ancient text. Okay, right. So I want you to look at a very important, significant shift that has happened in gender studies, right? Which is the approach to historiography, which is the Foucauldian approach to genealogy. Okay, what this simply means is that when women write, they may not necessarily write as feminists. But it's possible for you to read a text as feminists, irrespective of the author's, you know, questions. So the author that I have chosen here is Mahashweta Devi, and at no point of time Mahashweta Devi called herself a feminist. Right? So we recognize her as a subaltern writer. We recognize her as a post-colonial author. Okay. Similarly, Chimamanda Adichie, right, writing from Nigeria, right, and writing from a space where Chinua Achebe wrote, right, where post-colonial literatures, right, were centered around questions of nation and nationalism, right? And Chimamanda Adichie is a contemporary writer who questions this, right, notion of nation as a woman. So here you have two authors who question both nationalism, race, right? I mean, both nationalism and race, and the constitution of a nation at the cost of the exclusion of certain identities, including women. Okay, so this is basically a feminist position which allows you to look at literature as historiography. And what do we mean by historiography? Historiography is basically a rewriting of history, a rereading of history, a critical rethinking of history. So you have history with the capital H, but we know what history is. History is basically a long line of conquests, treaties, expansions, empires, emperors, kings who establish great empires. So you have the growth and you have the fall of the empire, and you have a long list of, you have Vikramaditya the first, you have Vikramaditya the second, you have Chalukya the first, Chalukya the fourth. I mean, name it. So this is our understanding of history. Our understanding of history is based on the creation of empires, which is a very colonial concept, right? So what would your understanding of the partition of India and Pakistan be? It would largely historically be the fact that India and Pakistan were separated, and they formed new nations, and that is how India got its independence. Period. That's it. And you might hear a little bit about the number of people who migrated from here and there, right, here to Pakistan and Pakistan to here, right, and the amount of violence that was meted out upon them. But it takes you to look at say somebody like Urvashi Butalia, the other side of silence, to understand that partition was not just a political act. It was an emotional experience. It was a highly emotional experience, especially for women who had to leave their homes behind, who had to literally sometimes leave things that were boiling on the stove behind. They had to leave literally their home and hearth. So there are narratives of women who leave behind, say, the neem tree or the mango tree in their backyard. They leave behind the compound wall. They leave behind the village well. They leave behind the neighbors who are Muslim, probably, right? And who they shared food with, whom they sat down with under the tree and, talked about, their daily lives, right? So I don't think anybody at that point of time wanted to be Indian or Pakistani because they were either Hindu or Muslim, right? Because identities are a lot more complex than that, right? And here is a history of memories. Here is a history of emotions. Here is a history that is painfully personal, which will never enter into the portals of your books of history or your museums or your narratives of history, whatever they be, right? And that is where literature becomes historiographic, because literature is able to give you the experience which is otherwise left out from the larger discourses of history with a capital H, right? And that is why women who write as women about experiences of women within the larger discourse of nation and nationalism become very, very important and very, very significant feminist writers. And this is a very important approach which is based on the materiality of a woman's experience. So it has to do with her body, it has to do with motherhood, probably it has to do with her relationship with the domestic space, right? And where is the domestic space in discourses of nation and nationalism? And why shouldn't the domestic space be part of a larger history? Or why shouldn't the story of a tribal, settlement in a small village be the history of Africa? That is what Chimamanda Adichie is asking, right? So what is the archaeology of the body if sex and gender are contingent historical moments? How does literature map the genealogies or inglorious origins of gender outside of hegemonic history? Okay, I think it's already 10:20. I will be winding up soon. Okay, how does literature narrativize the intersectionality of gender with race, class, nation, caste, and ethnicity. Okay, so let us look at two examples of the work of Mahashweta Devi and Chimamanda Adichie. One is the breast giver, right, taken from breast stories. Here you have the story of an upper caste woman, Jashoda, okay, whose husband Kangali Charan is very poor. They have many children in the family, and unfortunately for Jashoda, Kangali Charan, right, loses his limbs because the youngest son of the zamindar actually, buys this new motorbike, and he literally runs it over the feet. And look at the name Kangali Charan, right? So Charan means feet, and in this particular story, Kangali Charan loses Kangali. Kangal is very poor, right? So he is upper caste Brahmin in Bengali society, right? But he loses his limbs, and he is from the lower class. So Jashoda becomes the wet nurse for the Haldar family, which is the Zamindar family, right? So she starts breastfeeding all the children that are born into the family, right? So what Mahashweta Devi is doing here is to look at the complexity of, or the intersectionality of gender and caste. Because although Jashoda belongs to an upper caste, right, she takes on the role of a wet nurse because she has to provide for a family. And in order to provide for a family, she has to continuously, produce milk. And in order for her to continuously produce breast milk, she has to continuously bear children. So she literally becomes the cash cow of the family. Okay, and we know what happens to her at the end of the story. She dies of breast cancer. So I think the breasts have taxed themselves too much, and at one point of time, you see her lying in the hospital. She dies an orphan because there is nobody to claim her body, right? There is nobody to claim her because all the sons, including her sons and daughters, and the Haldar sons have all grown up and they have become very important men now, right? And nobody remembers the wet nurse who actually fed them, breast milk for money, right? So in this particular story, you have the critique of motherhood from a very Marxist perspective. So you have the use value and you have the exchange value, right? Motherhood in itself does not have any exchange value, and that is the reason why, although mothers produce children, they are not considered to be producers. They are considered to be reproducers. So the discourse of motherhood is the discourse of reproduction, right? But fathers become the producers. That is why the children get the name of the family, of the gotra, of the region, of the village, of the community, of the, name it. So when we take our father's names, what are we actually doing? We are acknowledging the fact that we are children of the father. And we acknowledge that the family tree, the lineage, right, is drawn from the father's side and not from the mother's side. Unless you belong to a matrilineal society, that's not going to happen. Okay? So the idea that, right, motherhood by itself does not have use value. But in the case of Jashoda, this use value is converted into exchange value. Because why is she breastfeeding the children of the Haldar family? She's doing this so that she can earn some income and keep the mouths full back at her own home where there are a lot of children. Okay, so look at this very unconventional historiographic treatment of motherhood, right? And how the idea that upper caste does not mean privilege. Upper caste can mean oppression provided you belong to a lower class, right? So the politics of class dominates over the politics of class here, and that is what happens with gender. Right? You are not just a woman, you are a woman, right, who has certain forms of oppression based on the class and the caste and other markers that you identify with, which means that your identity is a layer, right? It's a multi-layered, right, identity that you have, and there are identities that are constantly intersecting with other forms of identity. Okay, so within my own community, for example, right, I might have within the larger community, I might have privilege because I belong to an upper caste. But within my own community, because I'm a woman, I might have an inferior position. And that is what we mean by intersectionality, right? Similarly, Chimamanda Adichie is looking at this historical moment when Nigeria has the civil war. Okay, this is the 1960s. Okay, and this is basically her grandmother and grandfather who have witnessed the civil war, right? And there is a particular tribe, the Igbo tribe, which does not want to be part of the larger discourse of nationalism and doesn't want to be part of Nigeria. So the Igbo tribe wants to, constitute its own nation. And even before the civil war, right, the nation is announced. It is called Biafra, obviously, because it is a bisection, right? It is cutting away from, Nigeria, and it's constituting its African identity in terms of its indigenous, right, native tribes. Okay, so the Igbo tribe wants to be a nation of its own. It does not want to be homogenized into a larger nation, which is a result of decolonization from the whites. Okay, so I mean, the loss of life, right, the conflicts that people go through, and most of them have to leave their villages then because they are a minority, and Nigeria gets support from the US. It gets arms from the US, right? So the US supports Nigeria, it does not support Biafra. So you can imagine what happens to a small tribe, right, which fights against an entire nation which has support from the colonial white big brother. Okay, so I just want you to look at one instance in this text, which I think is, Adichie's feminism, which is a heterogeneous, plural, inclusive feminism. So you have the main protagonist, Olana, who is traveling in a train. Everybody is displaced. The entire tribe is displaced and scattered, right? And they are moving away from homes, running away from homes, right? Because they don't want to be burned down and killed by the, militant forces, right? So Olana is traveling in this train, and next to her there is a woman who is carrying this, child, right? And this child has very intricate, beautifully, intricately braided. She has a very beautifully braided head, right? And you know how African women, braid their, heads. So there's a little child, like a baby, a toddler, right, with very intricate braids, and there is a beautiful basket in which the woman is carrying this child, right? And Olana is fascinated by this, right? But after a few minutes, right, she realizes as the woman is getting down. No, I think it is time for Olana to get down, right? I think from a bus, not a train. Sorry. That is when she realizes that the child is dead, right? And the woman, right, has lost her child, her daughter, but she does not want to bury her. She does not want to give her up, and she is carrying her, right, wherever she goes, right? So Olana herself, right, has an adopted child, right? She does not have a child of her own, right? And here is a woman from, a lower, Olana is educated, the other woman is not educated, right? They belong to different strata of society, but the civil war has brought them together. And both of them are mothers who are looking at the fate of their daughters. One is protecting her daughter, that is Olana. She is trying to protect her as much as possible, right, from the insurgents, from the rebels. Okay, and here is a mother who has actually lost her daughter, but is refusing to give up her daughter because, right, her daughter is all she has. And the daughter becomes almost a monumental relic with her intricate braids. She is a reminder of what the Igbo tribe was, what Nigeria was before the civil war. And you look at the plight of women, okay, in a country which refuses to emerge. That is why it is called half of a yellow sun. It is, of course, in the poster here, you will see the full sun, but actually it is the logo of Biafra. And the logo of Biafra is, right, something that the soldiers wear on their, obviously on their uniforms, right? It is the image of a sun which is half, it has emerged half, it is yet to come out fully. And Biafra never emerges. There is no such thing called as Biafra because the entire tribe is completely subdued by violence and displaced, right? And they, very few of them, they go back to their villages, and there is no Biafra, right? So what happens to the women in a country where men are, hell-bent on being violent and, setting up a nation for themselves, right? So I mean, you will not see this in the history of Nigeria, right? You will see this in a literature such as that of Chimamanda Adichie, which will give you a personal history, a historicity of personal experience within the larger history. So, two other texts that I want you to look at. Do I have some time? Sorry. Let me just come back to the session. Can I take another 5 minutes? Is that all right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I think it's 10:30 already. I will just take 5 minutes and wind it up. Okay? Right. I have to start sharing again. Just a minute. Are you all with me? Are you able to relate to what I'm saying? Is the presentation clear? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It is clear.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I will just make it full screen again. Okay. So we have looked at different approaches to femininity, right? So we looked at approaches that are historiographic, which are intersectional, right? Which go beyond questions of equality or equity or equality with the men. So normally we look at feminism as, as a movement for equality or merely as a movement for equality, which it is not, right? Because it is not maybe questions of equality which matter to a few women. There might be larger questions of identity, which are questions of the tribe, questions of the nation, questions of identifying oneself in other terms other than being equal with men, right? And this is where the cultural specificities of feminism become very important, right? Because especially in India and in indigenous countries, or countries like Africa or the Afro American women, okay. I do not think their questions are questions of equality. Their questions are questions of intersectionality, of larger cultural challenges that they face because they belong to either a particular caste or a particular tribe, or the fact that there is a larger discourse of nationalism and nationhood which they may not relate to. Okay? Or these might be questions of religion. You look at Muslim women across the world, right? For them, the hijab or the burqa is not really a problem. It's not a problem for them simply because for them the parda or the burqa is a symbol of their religion. It is not necessarily a symbol of their gender. Okay, so it's very easy for us to say that the veil is oppressive, that women who are under the veil are oppressed. They may not be. Okay, that is a very Western feminist, radical feminist perspective. But I want you to look at the feminisms that go beyond this notion of the gender binary and ask very specific questions that are internal, which are personal to the one's own cultural space. Okay, so a very important shift that we need to make in discourses of gender is to start looking at masculinity, okay, which is not something that we do. We talk so much about women's oppression and women's equality. We don't really look at how masculinity is also constituted, how being male or being the alpha male is something that is celebrated. Okay, so I just want you to look at two very different works, and you might think, why has man put these two together? What is the connection between the two, right? The connection is that both of these are, texts which question hegemonic masculinity and heteronormativity. One is The Nightingale in the Rose. It's a short story by Oscar Wilde. I remember reading this in my 8th grade, right? So this is a story where a man promises, he is literally courting a woman. He wants to go out with with a woman for a dance, a beautiful young girl, okay? And, he wants a red rose to take to her that evening. And he finds that in the garden, there isn't even a single rose. There is one white rose that is left because it's going to be winter soon, okay? And there is this nightingale which sings for him through the night, every night, okay? And there is the silent presence of the nightingale. And the nightingale realizes the anguish of this young man, and it literally, puts the thorn of the white rose into its breast, and it sings throughout the night. And the lifeblood of the nightingale makes the rose red. Okay, and in the morning, right, the young man finds a beautiful red rose, and eventually, when he gives it to the young girl whom he is courting, right, she throws it away and she literally tramples it and walks upon it to another, she goes away to another man who is rich and more eligible. Okay, so I remember this text being taught to us as, the sacrifice of the nightingale, the altruistic nature of love, that the nightingale's love for the young man was purer than the love that he had for the woman. Okay, but if you actually look at the text, what Oscar Wilde is doing here, that Oscar Wilde himself had a different history of sexuality and he was imprisoned for it, right? So Oscar Wilde is actually questioning the notion of heterosexual love here, right? So is it is heterosexual love worthy enough of the nightingale losing its life, of its life ebbing away from its breast, of its blood reddening the white rose, right, to be trampled upon later. Okay, so in fact, he's questioning the very notion of love, which is so heterosexual for all of us in the Nightingale in the Rose. And you look at a Sri Lankan author like Shyam Selvadurai, right, who was writing at the point of time when the civil war is happening in Sri Lanka, when the Tamils and the Sinhalese are in conflict. So here you have a boy called RG who likes to play with dolls, who likes to play with girls in the backyard rather than play cricket in front of the house. Okay, and he grows up to realize that he is attracted to boys as a young boy. And this is the point of time when his ancestral house is burned down by the Tamils, and he has to, migrate to Canada with his, family, with his parents. So there is the immigration that happens at the end of the emigration, rather, that happens at the end of the story. And here you have a story of the changes that are happening in Sri Lanka and the violence that is being meted out by the men. And here you have a character called RG who refuses to be a man like other men, right? Who is more feminine, who is more, interested in, what he feels rather than what someone else thinks. So these are examples of, texts that can be taken to class which question the hegemonic notion of masculinity and heterosexual desire. Okay, so this is my last slide. Okay, so the idea that today we look at queering the text, what that simply means is that it is possible for you to read more masculinity and femininity through the through the queer lens, not necessarily through the traditional lens of man versus woman or woman versus man. Okay, so this text is a very beautiful poem. It's called Little Red Riding Hood, and it's written by Olga Braumus. She's a Greek poet. And what she does is she revisits all the classical myths of Greece, right? Especially the woman characters. And she looks also at the fairy tales, right? So she has poems on Cinderella. She has poems on, Red Riding Hood and other characters from fairy tales. Especially in Little Red Riding Hood, here you have a narrative voice, right? Which is a lesbian voice. And what kind of a lesbian text is this? This is not a lesbian text which celebrates the desire for another woman's body. Rather, it is a lesbian text which actually is nostalgic about the fact that it was her mother who gave birth to her. But because she is a lesbian, she cannot have a daughter who can come out from her own womb. Okay, so she says, I wish I had a daughter. So she says, mother, landscape of my heart, she calls her mother, right? She says, you're the landscape of my heart. And I really feel bad because there is nobody to stretch my wishbone and come out of my, body like I did from yours. Okay. And she says, although you told me that, I had to walk up to my grandmother's house with a basket full of goodies, right? And you asked me to walk the straight path. You said, do not smell the flowers. Do not go behind the bushes because there are wolves there. Okay. I, did not follow your instructions. I actually strayed from the path and I opened my basket with other girls who were walking back to their grandmother's house. Okay. So I hope you are able to understand the symbolic import of this story where Red Riding Hood does not discover, right, that her grandmother is a wolf, right, at the end of the journey, but rather strays from the straight path and opens her basket with other women. Okay, so this is a text of lesbian desire. And what kind of desire is this? This is a desire for a collective female consciousness. This is a desire for a collective of women. And this is a celebration of what we call as the lesbian triptych, which is, right, the grandmother and the mother and the daughter. And the fact that because she is lesbian, she cannot continue this tradition, right, and have a daughter of her own. Okay, so the idea that women's relationships can be imagined beyond heteronormative boundaries, right? And that it's possible for you to read a lesbian text, not necessarily in terms of, sexual desire, but in terms of a desire for a collective female consciousness. So this is an example of a text which allows you to look at same-sex love through a very different queer reading. So this is what we call as queering the text. Okay, right. So these are certain approaches which I thought I could bring to this session, which would probably help you to extend your practices of teaching in gender, research in gender, whatever it is that you're doing with gender, either in the classroom or outside of it. And I hope it has been useful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful words. This speaks of your exuberant passion and meticulous academic exposition. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you found it useful.
Yes,
And I
ma'am.
hope, I have been able to introduce something, new or a few new texts to you, right? Or at least I'm able to introduce a few new ideological approaches to gender.
Yes, ma'am, of course.
That was the whole objective. Yeah.
So much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Do you want to take questions and answers? Do you have time or you have to start with your paper presentations, right?
We have exceeded the time, ma'am. We have the other participants are waiting for the
Sure,
presentation.
sure, no problem. What you could do is you can maybe send me the email IDs of people who have asked questions.
Yes, ma'am.
I will
Yes,
be
ma'am.
happy to respond to the questions. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. We'll keep you informed about the same, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Savita, Dr. Shailaja, and Dr. Nagmani, and all the faculty of SRM University Department of English and Foreign Languages. Right. I hope to meet you all sometime later. Yeah.
Welcome,
Hopefully,
ma'am.
we can have more collaborations together academically. Thank you
you,
so
ma'am.
much. Thank you.
ma'am. Thank you.
Should I leave the meeting now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a nice day, and I hope you have interesting.
Thank
Sorry for exceeding the time limit. Yeah.
That's okay,
My
ma'am.
apologies. Yeah. Thank you.
Let us now move on to the third session of our two-day conference. The link has been shared in the group. You can just join the session through the link.